Good evening and welcome to The Square. Tonight we'll be discussing the regulation of the transport sector in Rwanda based on current reforms, actually recent reforms last week by the Rwandan Utilities Regulatory Agency known as RURA and the City of Kigali in this regard. Our topic areas for discussion tonight are looking at the challenges and some of the achievements in the transport sector. My name is Diana Mpisi, I'm part of The Square, and our guest for tonight is from RURA, Engineer Emmanuel Katabarwa. Welcome to The Square.
Thank you.
It's an honor to have you here. As always, on The Square, we're joined by the usual permanent family, part of The Square, Charles Harbour and Ephraim Rwamwenge.
Yeah.
Good evening, Diana.
Good to have you, as always. As you know, we are a four-person panel. We're usually with Berna, but Berna Namata is in Nairobi, but she is going to be with us on Skype. In fact, if I can just test, is she on Skype at this point? Berna, are you with us?
Yeah, sure. Thank you for having me.
Okay. I think later on we'll, yes, there she is.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So tonight, like I said, we are going to be discussing the recent regulatory reforms that were made in Rura, the hike of public transport in Rwanda, and so forth and so on. But just before we do, before we take a deep dive with our engineer here this evening, Charles and Ephraim, what are some of your thoughts on public transport? When was the last time you guys took public transport, public means?
I would not like to, I don't look forward to taking a public bus because gauging from the fact that Engineer Katabarwa came late because he was using public transport, I don't look forward so much to it. But that said, I must give credit to where it's due. I'm extremely impressed by the orderliness that you find in the public transport network, especially the buses. And you can see from the time Ritco came on board and from the time they even introduced the bigger buses. I must say,
Onatracom
yes.
days? Or?
Yeah, the evolution of Onatracom and the evolution from all these chaotic small mini buses, the Twejeranes that you used to see. I must say, engineer, you guys are doing a fantastic job there.
Thank you, sir.
The guy who supplies us internet at the office is a guy who has a contract to supply internet on public buses. And there's some things that are just, so to speak, almost not African. I was told last week there was a comedy show on the buses. And I'm like, where does this happen? Though, so on the buses side, I think generally on a scale of out of 10, as somebody who uses private means, I like the orderliness. I would give them 8 out of 10. I think the thorn in the flesh is still the motors.
Which is something we're going to discuss tonight.
Yes.
Ephraim?
You know, Charlie said two things that I'm not happy with. One, he said, he didn't answer your question about when was the last time he took public transport.
Oh yes, no. Can I answer that, Ephraim?
Okay, yeah.
Yes. The last time I used public transport was Rwanda to Nairobi.
You're funny.
That's smart, but we'll get you there.
This guy's a politician. No, another thing he said is that it's not African. You know, I don't also think that what we're doing is, there's a precedent for what we're doing in Rwanda with our public transport, or at least what we're trying to do, or at least even the rate of reform with what we're trying to do. And last time I checked, Rwanda is in Africa, so as far as I'm concerned, what we're doing is as African as it can be. But for me, I think the last time I took public transport was maybe about less than a month ago. I took a moto to beat that AU extraordinary meeting jam. You had to make do with what was there. But I think all in all, as somebody who took public transport, it was very orderly. I know a lot of innovation is coming into the space. A lot of private sector players are coming in to find more effective ways to make it safer and to make it cheaper. But I know we're going to talk about the price hikes, so I would want to know, because at some point they talked of the financial leakages having an economic benefit to the companies, but then now they're increasing the prices to adjust for fuel. Anyhow, we'll get to that at some point, but all in all, I'm happy with the way the public transport system operates in Rwanda.
Okay, and I would like to go to Berna. Berna, if you're with us, what is your take, before we take a deep dive with engineer Emmanuel Katabargwa here with us from Rura, on the regulation of transport sector in Rwanda? What's your take? When was the last time you took public transport? Just before we take a deep dive.
I must say, I'm among the few people on that panel that take public transport regularly. I don't own a car, for the record. But one I can say is that there's been tremendous progress in terms of the efficiency, because when they got rid of the mean buses, and then we had big buses on the road, in a way we've had some efficiencies. However, we still have a long way to go, because if you look at the frequency, you still have people waiting for a very long time, and there's still a bit of congestion. The price issue is a whole different matter, which I think we'll discuss much later.
Okay. I think hopefully we'll fix the sound as we go on in the show. Berna, you were just a bit unclear there, but I'm sure technicians are looking into fixing the sound later on in the show, because Berna, as you know, you're one part of the square, and definitely, even though you're not here with us, you're part of the show this evening. So technicians are looking to that, and for the public, we'll be hearing more from her as the show goes on, and definitely the sound will be fixed from her end. So Engineer Katabargwa, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so
tonight.
much for
We are going to take a deep dive into this. And my first question, and of course my colleagues are going to follow up with their own questions on this particular topic. Rura last week decided to increase public transport fares.
Yes.
5% on upcountry routes and 7%
Yeah,
in
was
Kigali.
right.
Oh, 7%?
7% for upcountry.
For upcountry
5%
routes, yes.
Yeah.
For the city of Kigali.
Okay, and 5% in Kigali. So this is against, of course, apparently against a backdrop of fuel hikes, increases in fuel, car insurance premiums, amongst other things. But our question tonight, and for the sake of our public, is can you shed more light on this, first of all, and especially whether or not this hike affects consumers negatively? That's the current worry. You know, will it affect consumers negatively, and what were the key reasons for doing this?
Thank you so much, Diana, for the question. I must tell the viewers that the fare regulation is a normal exercise that is carried out by the public transport regulator, which is in this case Rura. And as you said, before there is any review of the fares, there should be reasons to why. For this case, there were like 3 reasons to why we reviewed the fares. First, as you said, is the fuel increase. Last time we reviewed the fares, it was in 2015, November 2015. And by that time, we agreed with all stakeholders that the fares will increase or decrease if the fuel increased up to 959 francs per liter or decreased to 817 francs per liter. So as we speak now, the fuel has increased to more than 1,000 francs per liter. So there is a need to change the fares. Secondly, after 2015, there were a number of investments that were made. Some of these we can talk of the speed governors which were introduced. Apart from the speed governors, there are some other initiatives like Tap and Pay, which is helping us in electronic payment. All those cost money. And since the investors put some money to invest in public transport in order to improve the quality of service, the passengers had to pay back what the investors paid. So those are the few reasons to why we needed to review the prices. And unfortunately, they had to be increased because we made a lot of investments and the fuel also increased. But there are cases where fares reduce when we find that some of the parameters that are used in the model have reduced. So it's a normal exercise.
Can I just ask a question in regards to that? You know, one of the, I'm assuming if I understand this right, there was an agreement made between the investors, the bus companies and the various entities to help improve the efficiency, and Rura, that if the prices increase, or at least if certain parameters within the environmental ecosystem change,
Yes.
that prices will either increase or decrease.
Yes.
Now, you mentioned the aspect of investment. And my question is, whose responsibility is it to bear the return on investment? I mean this in the sense of, in the case of investors who go and invest in technology to improve the efficiency, the question is, did the citizens ask for this efficiency? And I say that, I asked that question based on people were paying, let's say, 100 francs, 200 francs to move from point A to point B. Now they're paying 400 francs. And the reason given to them is that it's to help the investor recoup the investment. My question was, when the investor was making that initial investment, were these citizens who are bearing the cost of this increase, were they consulted on this?
But before Engineer Katawara comes in, I think it's important that we draw a distinction between the reasons for the increase. For fuel to have increased by that margin from 2015 to 2018, by virtue of the fact that there's been no increment, I think it's just fair that there's an increment.
Exactly.
Yes.
Yeah, irrespective of all the other reasons. There is inflation and what have you.
Yeah.
Insurance, for crying out loud, has increased by a whopping 60% on car premiums. That alone is a good reason. Price of fuel has increased significantly. That alone is a good reason.
Yeah.
But the others, you can't. Tomorrow, the bus drivers will come and paint their cars. The motor riders will come and change the rims of their motorbikes.
We have made an investment.
We've made an investment.
We need the
so I think those are flimsy reasons that should not be entertained.
Exactly.
And they may water down the very good reasons.
Actually,
Yes,
that's why
yes.
the regulator, it's not that anything that they come up with is accepted. For instance, this exercise started about 3 months ago. So we have to vet what they are bringing to us. It's not that whatever they come up as an unnecessary cost is allowed. So for instance, we talked of these payment systems.
Yeah.
See, the payment system is helping us in several ways. For instance, before we introduced this tap and go, whereby it's a cashless payment system, people used to line up in peak hours trying to get change. You know, you have this 5,000 beer and you are hurrying up to catch the next bus. The conductor is telling you, I don't have change to give you. So you take like more than 5 minutes to get in. Suppose you have 10 people who have this 5,000 note. It delays them. So by introducing the tap and pay, people are moving into the bus swiftly, and therefore that's efficiency. There is the leakages in revenues, like one of you said. If the revenues are leaking through conductors, drivers, that means the investor who bought a bus is not going to be able to replace the bus. So there is a lot that we are getting from these initiatives. That's why we first vet and see, are these initiatives really
But Engineer, I'd just like also
necessary?
you to take a moment to answer Frame's question on the sense that, and this is also based on social media and what people are asking, the people who are bearing the brunt of this increase. I mean, it makes sense, as we've discussed. There are valid reasons, unavoidable reasons to this increase that you said, but the element where the investor also comes and makes a complaint here and there, and there's reason to increase the fare, that particular reason that was discussed as a stakeholder, the bus owners and Rura. Was there an element where consumers were also part of this consultation, because they're the ones paying the price fare, the increased price fare?
The process is that key stakeholders come together, including the Association of Consumers. In this case, it's called ADECO. So they come to us with relevant ministries. We can talk of Minicom, Ministry of Infrastructure, and the public transport operators. We sit and review the cost of giving the service to the public. And then from that cost, it's where we do our calculations and come up with the fare that is charged the passenger.
Can I ask another question? So the fare, let's say...
I'm just curious, sorry to interrupt. You said in that group, determining the fairness of the
price
fairness of the fare for the passenger, no pun intended. In that association or that group, or that, I'm assuming, what is it, an association?
ADECO.
The ADECO,
yeah.
it's
I
an
think it's
association
an
of
equivalent
consumers.
of the consumer protection.
Are they
agency.
consumers? Is there a consumer representative? I didn't catch
ADECO
that.
is
ADECO
an
is-
association
Is
of
the
Yes.
consumer
consumers.
representative?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah.
But of course, consumers' interests are catered of different entities, Minicom, ministries, other agencies, but specifically ADECO as a consumer
okay.
association also is represented.
I would like us to, hopefully the sound is fixed. Berna, I'd love for Berna to weigh in on this based on Engineer Katabarwa's response. Berna, is there something, I know if you were seated with us, you'd ask some tough questions. Is there anything you'd like to weigh in on?
I actually have a question,
Yes.
and I would like us to walk backwards and look at why Rwanda is actually regulating transport. From what I understand, it's because transport is a sensitive area. So Rwanda comes in to protect the vulnerable most of the time from price shocks. So my question to the engineer from Rwanda is, going forward, how are you going to protect ordinary people from price shocks that will continue to come? Because first of all, we have no control over the price of oil. It will go up anytime, anyway. How do you shield ordinary Rwandans from these price shocks? How much is government spending on subsidies to be able to absorb some of these external factors that affect the cost of transport?
Did you get that? I can repeat it for you.
Okay.
Oh, you got it.
So bits of it.
She's basically asking, as Rwanda, as government, basically, we're not in control of external factors, price shocks. We're not in control of the changes in fuel prices. So, are there any subsidies, or what is Rwanda doing, as a government agency, to protect consumers from these external price shocks going forward?
Well, I think it's unfortunate that the public transport system in Rwanda is not subsidized for reasons that we all may be knowing.
But I think there's some subsidy. The buses do not pay import duty when they are coming into the country.
That's a form of subsidy, but
Yes.
if you compare to developed countries, they top up what they get from the passengers. For instance, if the cost of operation is, let's say, 10 billions and they manage to collect 7 billion, the government directly puts in the 3 billions, apart from the reduction in taxes and all that. So in this case, we are not getting directly subsidies into the system.
Direct
So,
fuel injection.
Yes, that's a problem. But however, Rwanda is trying by all means to make sure that it's helping the public transport operators to cut the unnecessary costs. Okay, and by making the system efficient, it will reduce the impact of the increase in those factors that we are not able to control. Yeah. The other thing we are doing, as you may be knowing, we regulate fuel, pump fuel prices. So in most cases, we try to fix it so that it doesn't go up. Now, you might be knowing that in different countries in the region, fuel increases every day, but in Rwanda, at least it takes 2-3 months before it is, in Rwanda, it takes 2-3 months before it increases. So the government is doing whatever it can to make sure that the prices are somehow stable. But of course, sometimes there is necessity for increasing.
We talk of the regulation, or at least the role of Rwanda in regulating such, and I wanted to actually talk about it. So in this case, you are regulating the price of the fare, then you're going to regulate the
Pump price?
the pump price. But then what about in situations where, because most of this fuel is imported, actually all of this fuel is imported. There's that aspect of Forex. are the mechanisms, or at least institutional coordination between you guys and BENER to ensure that if you guys are going to go and control the pump price, that BENER is working on that end as well to match your regulation to ensure that it's in the best, it's in the interest for everyone, it's in the best interests of everyone involved, including the private sector. Because I say this based on, if you guys set a pump price and let's say the dollar goes up significantly, it becomes very expensive for the local players who are importing this fuel to afford it. Now, my question is towards that institutional coordination, and I know Charlie is big on institutional coordination. Yeah.
Well, there is a lot of coordination. As I told you, when we are setting prices, we call key stakeholders, including, well, depending on which prices we are setting, we call all those stakeholders which are involved, and we discuss and we look at different dynamics in that sector before we can set the prices or the fares. So there is coordination.
Okay. So based on that, the next question that I want to ask and that, you know, include in this particular conversation is the regulation of motors. The regulation of motors, in a bid to, you know, go into being a cashless economy, is having them metered in the near future. Apparently they had 6 months to do it, beginning of this year, if I'm not mistaken. So for our question here at the Square is how, number one, how do you say to people who say that this is over-regulation? You know, let free market forces be. Let this fall to demand and supply, you know, motors or cabs, taxi cabs, so to speak. What do you say to people who say this is over-regulation and motors should just be left to free market forces? And the second thing is, how do we, you know, as a country plan to, and as RURA, plan to implement the metering of these motors?
Well, the free market argument is really a challenging one, and one would wonder whether the free market exists because there is always some form of control. Coming to motorcycles, I don't think it's a sector that we can just let it just control itself, you see. We've had cases whereby these drivers are misbehaving, they are snatching people's bags, they are conspiring in committing crimes, so we can't really let them do whatever they want. When it comes to what we are doing, we are talking of the meters, but the meter is one of the things that we are introducing. We are also introducing a GPS which is attached to the meter, and the GPS will help us in knowing where they are, locating a motorcycle. For instance, if someone committed a crime in a given area, we can be able to zero in on 3-4 motorcycles that were there in a given period of time, so investigation becomes easier. But also with the meter, it's going to help us in other forms, for instance, the hailing services. Take an example today, if you want to ride a motorcycle, you have to walk to the nearest main road where you can find a motorcycle, to the nearest stage where they park. But in case you can't walk, that means you can't access the service. But with this meter, you are going to be able to either get it from your phone, using an app, or maybe using a USSD code. So it is going to come up with different features which are going to help the passenger get the best quality of transport service that is there.
Before we cut to break, I'd like to hear from Charles and Ephraim, and we'll hear from Berna when we come back from the break. And I am crossing fingers that the sound will be much better with the connection over Skype. So when we come back to the break, Berna, we'll get to you. Hopefully we're fixing the sound. But weighing in on the motors and what Engineer Katabarwa has very succinctly put forward, what's your take on the regulation of motors?
Okay.
Motorcycles.
Yeah.
My biggest issue with motors, I think first of all the metering is really a commendable idea, because you know people need, especially from a perspective of paying a fair price. One of the biggest issues you usually hear is that a bike will take a very long route to get to a certain place where they can charge you much more than they should be charging you. But on the issue of the safety and security of the motorbikes, and the high alarming causes of death, and people being actually maimed, people losing their limbs and being incapacitated for the rest of their lives. I'd like to know how you're working with the other institutions, especially the National Police, to ensure that this very high rate of motorbike accidents is curbed. And you know, the spiral effect of that is extremely high. You have today insurance companies that have shied away from insuring motorcycles, even public service vehicles, because of the claims being too high. And that is loss in revenue for everybody. Yeah, so there is a very big challenge there, Emmanuel. Yes.
Yeah, it's a big challenge. That's why we are working on reforming the industry. And as you said, we are working with the National Police, specifically the Traffic and Road Safety Department. We've been testing the system for the past 1.5 years, trying to make sure that everything is in order. And as you said, after the introduction of speed governors, transport accidents decreased in public buses, but with motorcycles it has increased. That's why we are looking forward to decreasing also the accidents in motorcycles, because with this system, with the GPS, we can be able to tell a motorcycle that is exceeding the allowed speed.
So they get automatic tickets?
Yes, automatic tickets, because we will be having a control center whereby we can see whoever is overspeeding, and it's going to be easy to locate them. So it's going to be easy, and above that, if someone knows that you are tracking him, you are keeping an eye on them, definitely it will change their behaviors.
So, being told we have to take a break, but we'll come back to this conversation in less than a minute. We'll be back after the break. Please stay with us.
Many people have been asking what we have been up to. Well, we have told the different stories from decision makers, but this time round it will be different. We will be getting head to head with various influencers and get to the heart of the matter. It is not an easy ride, but we'll endeavor to get you there. It will be insightful, informative, and at times we will agree to disagree, because we are the bridge to your leaders.
Welcome back to the Square. Tonight we are talking about the regulation of the transport sector in Rwanda, specifically looking at public transport. We are joined here by a rural representative, Mr. Engineer Emmanuel Katabarwa, and he's here with tonight, and we've been talking about the tariffs, the increase in price fares on public transport, and the regulation of motors. I am going to go to our next question based on time and also connectivity issues with Berna, who will try and get towards the end of the show. Unfortunately, the connection is really poor. But before we go and read tweets from the people who have been responding to this conversation on our social media, on Twitter specifically, the hashtag, as you can see on the screen, is this hashtag the Square Rwanda, so please use it to respond to us. But this question is to you, and please, Charles and Ephraim, follow up. So last year in June, there was a decision between stakeholders, RURA and your other stakeholders, to actually make Kigali a public city.
Yes.
Sorry, a public transport-oriented city. This is getting people to walk to work or take bicycles with our heels. In this research, to walk to work to make them more fit. And this way was the reason to do this was also to modernize the public transport system and to decongest the public transport system and cars in general in the city. So our question from the Square is, as one of the stakeholders involved in these plans, how practical are these measures to make Kigali a public transport-oriented city? And what's the status of these plans?
If I can come in first, I think the whole idea of a green city and a public transport city, there are lots of initiatives. The Kigali City Master Plan provides for a rapid transport corridor. We have car-free zones. We have car-free days. Unfortunately, I failed my Spanish classes, otherwise my choice of words would have been different on this matter. But I think we have been overly ambitious on this. And the biggest people who are suffering are not only the people who use public transport, but the businesses as well. If you look at, for example, the central business district, ideally you would imagine that in the areas where we have said no vehicular circulation, at certain hours, either when people are going to work or leaving work, public transport should be allowed to get into those zones.
Yeah.
The car-free zones.
Into the car-free zones. Then it starts making a big difference. Then in certain areas you have seen, and I would like to really, Emmanuel, when you come in on this, to expand a little bit more on how you're coordinating with the other authorities, especially the city of Kigali and the Rwanda Transport Development Agency, RTDA. Because I feel RTDA is frustrating your efforts in providing adequate public transport. If you're to look at the bicycle lanes that are next to pedestrian lanes,
how safe is that?
Over very long distances, and in some cases on both sides of the road. Yeah. And that the immediate impact of that is that people who use public transport have to trek very long distances to get to a bus stop. Then it's self-defeating. So I think we have been overly ambitious about this whole public transport and not providing for private cars in certain areas. It's something that I think needs to be seriously relooked into. Yes.
Okay. We have 18 minutes. I'm being told by my producer we have 18 minutes, but please let us allow engineer to answer the question.
Well, I don't think we are over-ambitious, because if you could see what is taking place in developed countries, we have these car-free zones all over. Actually, access to the city is sometimes restricted to public transport or pedestrians only. When it comes to Rwanda, as you said, the way the system is coordinated, we do have what we call Public Transport Steering Committee, which is a committee that brings together RTDA, RURA, Minifra, COK, and the Rwanda National Police. So we sit on a round table and discuss different issues, and most of these decisions, that's where they are taken from. So saying that there's no coordination, I don't really...
I didn't say there was no coordination.
He said it's overambitious.
Yeah, I just said if you are not diplomatic with the truth, you would have preferred to say you preferred better coordination.
Of course, there's always room.
There's always room for improvement.
Yeah.
You
No,
got it. You said it right.
Can I say something?
Yes.
For me, I genuinely think that we have not addressed a very fundamental aspect when it comes to making Kigali a public transport-oriented city. You talked of developed countries, but don't forget developed countries have a completely different culture in their entirety. In Rwanda, if somebody saw me walking in the street, they would actually call me and ask me if something is okay. They'd be like, Ephraim, is everything okay? Do you need a ride? if somebody saw me on a motor or in public transport, there's an image that people would be like, but is everything okay? What happened to your car? And that mindset that we currently have, that public transport is considered less privileged or less flamboyant or less, you're less successful or less achieved in life because you're using public transport, needs to be addressed. But then the question I have is, how is it being addressed? Because I know for sure we talk of, we need to have dedicated bus lanes, we need to have good routes, we have to have good payment systems. But what about the cultural mindset shift that needs to take place for people to actually park their cars at home or sell them and jump onto a bus?
Well,
Yeah, and even in addition to that, please remember that as of a few days ago, the city of Kigali closed down churches that did not have ample parking, amongst other reasons.
Exactly.
So if I was a pastor in that church, I would say, I don't have ample parking because all the people who come to my church are supposed to be using public transport. Bars and restaurants are closed because, amongst other reasons, they do not have ample parking. So it's self-defeating to a large extent, Emmanuel.
well, actually, public buses public cars are supposed to be used in such instances where people are going to maybe churches, visiting friends, but when it comes to going to the central business district where there is a lot of congestion, people should know that they have to take the buses. That's why buses are given priority.
But why would they? That's the question.
Can
Those
you,
that have the capacity to
before you answer, maybe Brenna might have an answer to this question or weigh in as well. Brenna, if you're with us, because right after this we're going to our Twitter feed, would you like to weigh in at this point, Brenna?
Issue, which is why should people look at people using public transport in a certain way? So that has to be addressed, and it can only be addressed if public transport is used by everybody. We need to have ministers using public transport on a day-to-day basis so that everyone understands that public transport is for everyone and not for a certain class.
True.
But that can only happen if it's efficient. So no matter what you fix, if it's not efficient, if it's not convenient, if it's not addressing issues around time, it will remain talk. You keep talking about all these initiatives, but no one will get on the buses.
Thank you, Brenna. Absolutely valid point. If our leaders can actually get
Walk
on a
the
bus, walk the talk, that would really change the mindset. Because it's true. Some of us, it's so easy for us to be in New York or Paris, and we'll walk like 2 kilometers.
Or get onto
6
the
blocks,
bus.
10 blocks.
Yeah.
Or get onto the bus.
To walk on Kigali streets.
And exactly,
FXA.
because of the mindset we have. So I really appreciate Brenna's point on leaders walking the talk and doing this as well.
I think she's right. If we are to attract more people to use the public transport system, it must be safer, it must be reliable, it must be accessible. But if we see the kind of public transport we have, well, it's cheaper, it's becoming safer with the introduction of these speed governors,
and modern.
Introducing modern buses, but still it's not reliable. For instance, if you want to catch a bus, you never know when it will arrive, and that's a hindrance to many people. That's why people are
In fact,
that
was before we break off. We have very few minutes left. Before we break off, some of the tweets, people saying, okay, we've done well and good with our transportational system, public transportational system, but the issue is the reliability.
Yes,
people still queue,
and
it's still an issue. And I think this is something
and that's what
that
we
you're
are working on.
Okay.
But before we reach there, we had to settle some of the
issues
before,
outstanding.
yes.
Can I ask you a question about the dedicated bus lanes?
No, the producer is going to
can't.
cut us short in the middle of the show, so I need to read the tweets before we.
I'll also tweet so you can ask us.
So this is from Anthony Mulindwa on Twitter, and he's asking that first of all, I thank the presenter, but I am not convinced about the way they have answered the question of a consumer representative. I think that is the Adeko question, and he says because the members they have mentioned they don't use tap and go system that's worthy to represent. So I think what Anthony is saying is that the
Yes.
consumers don't really use tap and go per se.
No, the guys on this ADECO are not
cooperative.
actual. These guys from Miniacom and
Yeah.
Mini-Infra are not
They're not tap and go
necessarily
people.
guys who use the buses. Guys have their cars, they move from point A to point
What do
B.
you have to say to that
Well,
briefly before we break off?
I don't think most of the people who are on that panel don't have private cars. Most of them ride buses, but it does not mean that if you are riding, you have a private car, you don't know what is taking place in the buses. So at the core, most of the people in the core don't have cars. And most of the time, we who are in this process, most of the time we go and ride the buses. We know what is taking place. We know what are the issues. I think the only challenge is that we are not yet there. We don't have the means to make our public transport reliable. But the issues, we know them. We know what the solution should be. But we are still lacking that.
Must push, yeah.
Yes.
Ephraim, do you want to add something? There's something you wanted to say before I broke off to Twitter.
About the dedicated bus lanes. You know, this is a question we've all been asking. People are like, are we going to expand the roads? Are we going to close off one lane for a few hours and allow buses to pass? What's the plan around dedicated bus lanes? Are we going to widen the roads, add a third lane, fourth lane?
The roads are already being widened.
The roads are already being widened.
Most of them.
Can you
two
delete
lane or
that
4 lane?
bicycle lane?
Well, that's for the city of Kigali, but we equally need the bicycle lanes. Yeah.
So there's one tweet from Hula Hooping. We have 5 minutes left. And Hula Hooping, very interesting Twitter handle, says, and you can read it from there. She says, why so many undeserved routes? What Gishushu, Nyarutarama, Nyabugogo routes? Foot traffic shows good business for buses and meet a key need. What do you infer from her tweet?
I think my reading from that tweet is that there are certain routes that you hardly see buses plying. If you look at that route from Nyarutarama
to Gishushu.
yes.
There used to be a bus, then all of a sudden they stopped that route. Yeah.
And then the one now on the lower road that goes through, you take Chinamba, Nyarutarama, you take Chinamba all the way up to
it has people standing there like this.
Yes.
So these are things that I think we'll address.
Well, I don't think the routes that they mentioned all have buses. And this is because some of the routes you don't find there enough passengers. You know, if
it
a
has
bus,
to be lucrative. Yes.
it has to be lucrative. Otherwise, you would have a bus running without passengers, and the forum they
That's
will
a
never.
lot.
But you guys will just increase the price to allow the investor to get the return.
That's
on
Well,
investment.
if we had to have a bus on each and every road, that means people who are on such roads without enough passengers would pay a lot of money. And
Very quickly.
they wouldn't be able to manage it.
Okay. We have less than 5 minutes. I'd like to go back to Bernard just very quickly to give some closing remarks as we come to the end of our show. And the next closing remarks will be from you. Bernard, some closing remarks on the transport sector in Rwanda and the regulation of it.
I think for me, what's key is making public transport reliable and affordable. Government has to find a way of providing subsidies, to protect vulnerable people from price shocks that will continue to occur.
Okay, thank you very much. And a few words from you as we end on this note.
Yes, well, when we started the show, I heard from Charlie and Ephraim who have never rode buses. And as one Gustavo said, a developed country is where the poor do not own cars, but where the rich ride buses. So we are looking forward to a situation whereby like most of us will be riding buses, and to have such a situation, the bus system should be reliable, and that's what we are striving to have. we are introducing ICT in bus management. If you see our buses, they are not really coordinated. You can't know the distance between two consecutive buses. You can't know when to arrive. The passengers are not given information on when the next bus will arrive. So that's the next steps that we are going to work on, to make sure that we find investors who are going to invest in the reliability of the buses. And once we have such a systems, we are sure the bus system is going to be liked by most of the people, and it is going to be fun-laden.
Absolutely, and I think personally from me, I would really like to see the private sector being encouraged to be a key player in really bettering the public transport system in this country. 2 minutes, 30 seconds, 30 seconds.
I was going to say, just in closing, for me, back to what you're saying about the private sector, you cannot, I feel like we are relying on RURA too much to come up with the solutions for this. I feel like the role of RURA mainly is to help people, to help with changing the mindset. Then once people actually understand that that it's something that they would want, we know that there's demand and there's an economic case which a business person can then invest money towards without RURA having to step in to increase prices so they can get the return on investment. So for me, if we can just change that mindset that buses are, and granted he said efficiency, which will then help with that cause, I think then we are onto something.
We're really on something. Charles, 30 seconds.
2 points. One,
giving
credit to where it's due.
15 seconds.
Giving credit to where it's due, our public transport system has improved significantly. But my biggest worry is RURA. Why are water meters wrong? RURA. Why should pump prices be brought down or up? RURA. Why is electricity not
they increased it by 15% to 30%.
Yes, RURA. Why aren't buses working? RURA. Why do motors have a problem? RURA. Why do public cleaning companies do not perform their duty? RURA. Why is garbage collection not being done properly?
Okay, Charlie, we get the point. We get the point.
So I think RURA is too amorphous an institution that some of these very, very important matters may not be given the weight that they do because there's too much weight on
but
their
maybe it's
shoulders.
because we actually over depend on RURA to
that's
keep
what
us
he's
stepping in.
saying.
That's
what he's saying.
So we're not blaming RURA per se.
Yes,
we are
yes,
saying the
yes.
private sector, we need to encourage a conversation.
Not even the private sector. Not even the private sector. Other government institutions. Other government institutions need to also step up and do that job. Instead of saying RURA just come and regulate. It doesn't. They needs to. RURA does the job of regulation. It doesn't do the job of coordination, the job of verification. Actually, even the implementation of regulation is not that responsibility. It's, you find the police are supposed to get involved to a certain extent to ensure people are not overspeeding. Like I said, regulation, and I'll say this in closing, one sentence. The issue with regulation, when you see when there's a drastic failure in regulation, it normally calls for more regulation. And that can, and without people actually looking to find out why there's a failure in the initial regulation. And so that for me is where we can actually solve this issue of RURA, like he said, RURA too much being put on RURA's shoulders.
Yeah, so basically that's what we're saying, absolutely. Too much is probably being put on RURA's shoulders, and I think has been doing a fantastic job so far, but we need other key stakeholders to really step it up, including the private sector. So my producer is telling me we are done. I'd love to continue this conversation, and I think it's a conversation that will continue. It's an evergreen conversation. It's always there, so we'll definitely want to have RURA back here and have a more in-depth discussion on other issues. So thank you very much for joining us. It's been a pleasure. Charles, Ephraim, Berna in Nairobi, I hope you're well. Thank you for joining us over Skype.
Thank you, Calvin.
Lovely. And with that, we've come to the end of tonight's show. Keep the conversation going using the hashtag #TheSquareRW. And the topic for today was the regulation of the transport sector in Rwanda. Thank you for joining us.